The air in the private dining room was thick, not with grief, but with the cloying scent of money and Leela, combination Harold, my late husband, always despised. I stood near the mahogany-paneled wall, clutching a teacup that felt dangerously fragile in my hand. 3 days had passed since we buried him beneath the ancient oak at St. Jude's. 3 days, and the vultures had already convened. I was Evelyn Thorne, 68 years old, widow of Harold Thorne, and until 72 hours ago, just a retired English teacher living modestly on a decent pension and 50 years of shared memories. But Harold wasn't just a husband. He was the founder of Thorne Strategic Assets. It's a financial consulting firm whose value, according to the documents being shuffled on the conference table, was astronomical. I hadn't concerned myself with its balance sheets. Harold handled the world. I handled our home across the room. My son Bryce stood beside his wife, Camilla, wearing a suit that cost more than my annual pension. Bryce looked weary, pale, the picture of the burdened air. Camilla, however, was radiant. Her black silk dress was less a garment of mourning and more a statement of imminent ascension. She caught my eye and offered a thin, practiced smile that kind politicians use when they know you're listening but don't care what you think. This gathering, they called it a legacy review meeting, was ostensibly a civil discussion with Harold's longtime legal counsel, Mr. Alistair Finch, to ensure a smooth transition. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to establish a new order, one where I, the simple English teacher, faded into the background. The meeting began not with a eulogy or a shared memory, but with Mr. Finch clearing his throat and adjusting his reading glasses. He spoke in the clipped, passionless tones of a man discussing municipal bonds. As per Harold's final instructions, all primary liquid assets and the controlling interest in Thorne Strategic Assets are now held in the Thorne Irrevocable Trust. Evelyn, as the surviving spouse, you are named the primary beneficiary and, critically, the sole executive trustee. A ripple went through the small audience. Bryce's jaw tightened. Camilla's radiant smile flickered, replaced by a sudden, intense gaze fixed on me. They hadn't expected the trust structure to be so absolute. They had anticipated a joint trusteeship, or perhaps one where Bryce, the designated heir apparent, held the decisive vote. Mr. Finch continued, oblivious to the undercurrents. This means, Evelyn, that all major operational, financial, and strategic decisions concerning Thorne assets are now legally yours to approve, veto, or execute. Camilla could hold her silence no longer. She leaned into Bryce, whispering fiercely, but in a voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. This is madness. She taught Shakespeare, not derivatives. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, but years of managing unruly high school classes had taught me the power of stillness. I merely looked at her, calmly. She paused, realizing she had been overheard, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down, letting her disdain flow freely. Mrs. Thorne, Camilla began, using the formal address like a weapon. With all due respect to your admirable career in the public sector, the decisions we are discussing involve billions. You simply do not have the experience base or the necessary temperament to navigate the geopolitical currents that dictate the firm's success. This is not about sentiment. It is about protecting Harold's legacy. It is about the future. Bryce finally stirred, offered a weak defense that was, in fact, an insult. Mom, Camilla doesn't mean any disrespect. She just means, well, she means the stakes are too high. We need to maintain the firm's stature. We can't afford any disruptions. He glanced pointedly at my worn but meticulously tailored black wool coat. It was clear that I was the disruption. Disruptions, Bryce? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He lowered his head, avoiding my gaze, a familiar posture of guilt. Mom, your life. It's always been about community and simplicity. This environment, it's ruthlessly competitive. You understand? Camilla is only concerned that the Thorne name remains. Tier 1, that the firm's reputation built on Harold's incredible work is not damaged by unnecessary complications. Camilla stepped forward, possessing the stage. Her voice, usually artificially sweet, was now cold, professional, and utterly dismissive of my existence. Let's be brutally honest. Evelyn, she declared, crossing her arms over the black silk. The pearls at her throat gleamed, a stark contrast to the small gold locket Harold had given me decades ago. The kind of modest, public-facing life you live. Your quaint house, your old car, your lack of engagement with the Chicago elite that simply does not align with the Thorn brand. We are handling the portfolios of heads of state, tech billionaires, and global institutions. Your poverty will not taint this firm. The statement hung in the air, a venomous echo of the contempt I had faced many times before, yet never so explicitly. The word poverty felt like a physical blow, stripping away 50 years of shared love and partnership. Leaving only the financial divide, Mr. Finch coughed nervously into his hand. Visibly uncomfortable, but Bryce remained silent, confirming his complicity in Camilla's calculated cruelty. This wasn't a meeting about a will. It was an attempted erasure. They saw me as a placeholder, a temporary inconvenience to be managed, silenced, and bought off before they could fully seize control of the Thorn empire. They believed that lacking financial literacy meant I also lacked the moral authority to stand against them. But in that moment, as the word poverty echoed, something shifted inside me. The tears I had shed for Harold dried up, replaced by an unfamiliar, crystalline coldness. The English teacher who valued patience and peace retreated. And the matriarch, the one Harold had secretly entrusted with his life's work, finally emerged. I placed the trembling teacup back onto the saucer, the sound sharp and definitive in the sudden silence. I met Camilla's triumphant gaze, and for the first time she saw not the grieving widow, but the woman who had spent 4 decades training minds for battle. I realized they had gravely underestimated the power of the one thing they believed. I lacked ruthless discipline. "Mr. Finch," I said, my voice steady and surprisingly low, forcing all eyes back to me. "Before we proceed to any discussions of complications or the firm's stature, I believe it would be prudent for us to review the specific legal structure of the trust, line by line. I've taught English, yes, but I also taught the precise meaning of every single word, and I intend to understand the exact weight of every one of Harold's final wishes." The color drained subtly from Camilla's perfectly made-up face. Bryce looked up, his confusion deepening into a flicker of sudden apprehension. They had expected meekness, not an intellectual challenge. The real battle for the Thorn legacy had just begun, not with a contract, but with the parsing of a single, well-placed sentence. My demand to review the trust documentation line by line was met with thinly veiled annoyance. Camilla shifted her weight, a subtle, impatient gesture that screamed of expensive shoes tapping on an antique floor. Bryce, recovering his composure, attempted a patronizing tone. "Mom, it's highly unnecessary. Mr. Finch knows the document backward and forward. The trust is boilerplate, standard estate planning. We really need to move on to the transition plan. The firm needs stability right now." I didn't address Bryce. I kept my gaze fixed on Mr. Finch, who was now clearing his throat with increasing vigor. The lawyer was a creature of comfort and precedent, and my unexpected insistence on legal minutiae was clearly upsetting his schedule. "Mrs. Thorn is entirely within her rights." "Bryce," Mr. Finch conceded, his voice grudging. He pulled a thick, leather-bound volume toward him, the original trust document, and flipped it open with a sigh. "However, I assure you, Evelyn, the bulk of this document is standard legal language. It is dense. I have taught Moby Dick." "Mr. Finch," I replied, my voice dry, "I assure you I have an appreciation for density. Please begin with Article 4 concerning the fiduciary duties of the executive trustee." I watched Camilla's face as Mr. Finch began reading. She was struggling to maintain the veneer of sophisticated boredom, but the tension around her eyes betrayed her. She was used to sweeping legalities aside with a wave of her hand and the assumption that the poor and the elderly could be dismissed with a few well-placed barbs. She hadn't counted on the retired English teacher treating the trust like an essay that required close, critical reading. As the lawyer droned through the clauses detailing my immense power, the right to hire, fire, dissolve, and liquidate Camilla's hostility intensified. Her whispers to Bryce became more urgent, punctuated by sharp, frustrated intakes of breath. She's wasting our time, Bryce. She doesn't even know what leveraged acquisition means. This is absurd. Bryce finally broke the spell of his own silence and addressed me directly, concern morphing into open aggression. Mom, stop. Look, we know you're the executive trustee. Fine, but Harold and I had a standing agreement. I run the business day to day. I manage the accounts. You just signed the papers. That's what he wanted: stability and continuity. You are jeopardizing everything he built by dragging your feet on basic paperwork. I listened patiently, allowing him to vent his frustration. I noticed that throughout his speech. He repeatedly used the phrase Harold and I run the business, subtly excluding my 50 years of partnership, Bryce, I began, waiting until the volume of his complaints subsided. In our house, Harold and I had another standing agreement. Before making any major decision, be it moving cities, changing jobs, or buying that ridiculous boat you convinced him to purchase, we always read the fine print together. Every single word. It was a partnership, not a monarchy. I turned to Mr. Finch. Mr. Finch, please skip ahead. I am particularly interested in Article 6, Section 3. The section titled Stipulations Concerning Extraordinary Liquidation or Asset Sale. The silence that followed was absolute. Camilla went rigid. Liquidation. Evelyn, are you serious? Why on earth would you be interested in that section? Her voice was shrill, laced with panic. Pure curiosity. Camilla, I replied, allowing a soft, non-committal smile to touch my lips. In my old profession, we called it foreshadowing. Harold was a meticulous man. I am simply following the narrative clues he left behind. Mr. Finch located the section, his fingers seeming to fumble slightly on the expensive paper. He began reading the dense legal prose, which detailed the conditions under which a controlling interest in Thorne's strategic assets could be liquidated or sold off. The language was technical and highly convoluted, focusing on financial conditions like market downturn exceeding 20% on the NYSE index or documented irreparable dissolution of the firm's core executive team. I listened intently, not to the financial jargon, but to the legal rhythm and phrasing, searching for any deviation from the standard boilerplate. Harold had always enjoyed injecting a touch of his own personality into legal documents. After several minutes of reading, Mr. Finch reached the end of the section and looked up, relieved that the dense terminology was over. There you have it, Evelyn. Standard conditions for liquidation requiring the trustee's written approval, course, and a 7-day notice period. Thank you, Mr. Finch, I said, nodding slowly. But before you close that section, please read the very last paragraph on that page. The one separated by the large indentation. Mr. Finch frowned. He scanned the page again, muttering to himself. Ah, yes. A supplemental addendum initialed by Harold. I nearly missed that. It's highly unusual to place this outside the numbered sections. Camilla's eyes were darting between the lawyer and me, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She was beginning to understand that I wasn't just wasting time. I was hunting for something specific. Mr. Finch began reading the indented paragraph, notwithstanding the financial stipulations outlined above, and in recognition of the critical importance of trust and ethical stewardship over mere short-term financial gain. The executive trustee reserves the absolute, non-revocable, non-disputable right to unilaterally veto any proposed extraordinary liquidation or sale of the controlling interest, if, in the executive trustee's sole and absolute judgment, said action is deemed to be against the moral and reputational interest of the Thorne legacy, or if the proposed execution of said sale demonstrates a profound lack of professional respect for the trustee or the foundational values of the firm. He paused, removing his glasses and staring at the page in surprise. Well, I've never seen language quite so subjective in a major trust document. It's legally sound, but highly unique. It gives the executive trustee you, Evelyn, extraordinary power, independent of any financial considerations. Powerful. Silent understanding passed between the lawyer, the heir, and the matriarch. Harold hadn't just made me the trustee. He had made me the moral gatekeeper. The man who taught me to read every word had given me the power to judge the intent. Behind the numbers, Camilla's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. She slammed her hand down on the table, the crystal glasses rattling violently. That is absurd. It's meaningless emotional drivel. Moral interest. Lack of respect. That is unenforceable. Her voice was a ragged shriek, utterly devoid of the black silk sophistication she had worn moments before. On the contrary, "Camilla," I said, maintaining my serene voice, which only seemed to enrage her more. In law, sometimes the most subjective language carries the most weight, precisely because it is non-negotiable. Harold was giving me a very specific tool to judge not what you intend to do, but how you intend to do it. I looked pointedly at her dress, then at Bryce's bowed head. And based on the comments made here, today's specifically, the one concerning the taint of my poverty, it seems I already have ample evidence of your profound lack of professional respect for the executive trustee. The silence that followed was heavy with dawning horror. They had given me the very evidence I needed to wield the legacy veto by insulting me and my way of life. They hadn't just insulted the widow. They had provided grounds for a massive legal and financial intervention. The matriarch had found her weapon. And it was a word, respect. Camilla was vibrating with rage, her breath catching in sharp, shallow gasps. She looked at Bryce, expecting him to leap to her defense, to dismiss the conversation as an old woman's rambling or a grieving mother's delusion. But Bryce was frozen, his face a mask of escalating dread. He finally understood the gravity of his wife's outburst and his own complicity in the silence that followed. "Mom, wait," Bryce pleaded, his voice cracking. "Camilla didn't mean it that way." She was stressed. It was a poor choice of words, a terrible choice, but it wasn't an attack on the firm's values. It was about stability, I promise you. Was it, Bryce? I asked, leaning forward slightly, forcing him to meet my gaze. Or was it the truth? Did you truly believe your father's legacy, built on decades of integrity and careful management, would be tainted by the simple, honorable life of the woman he loved most? The woman who helped him build that legacy by prioritizing our family and his peace of mind. My voice wasn't loud, but it resonated with a quiet authority that stripped away his practiced executive facade. The retired English teacher had become the judge. The verdict was clear. Camilla, recovering slightly, attempted to regain control through manipulation. She approached my side of the table, her tone shifting instantly to saccharine concern. "Evelyn, dear, this is all just a massive misunderstanding. Please, you're reading too much into a minor comment. I admire your thrift. I truly do. But we're talking about the market, about momentum. We can't allow petty emotional squabbles to affect the global economy. I propose that you step away from the active management for 6 months. Take a much-deserved break, perhaps a cruise on us. You can review the decisions remotely. It's the standard arrangement for a gentle transition." The attempt to bribe me with a vacation was insulting in its transparency. She was offering me a gilded cage, hoping to separate me from the documentation and the power that Harold had entrusted to me. "A gentle transition," I repeated, folding my hands neatly on the table. "And what precisely is the transition to Camilla? A transition to a state where the executive trustee, the moral gatekeeper of this firm, is seen as an unnecessary complication and is conveniently absent while all the real decisions are made." Camilla flushed crimson. She had run out of elegant maneuvers. "Evelyn, if you refuse to be reasonable, you leave us no choice. Weber's and I, the ones who actually understand the business, will have to contest the trust. We'll argue that the moral and reputational Interest clause is unconscionable in a modern financial instrument, and that your lack of business experience renders you unfit for this role. We will tie this up in probate for years, and the firm will suffer because of your stubborn refusal to act with common sense. This was the core of their strategy: intimidation and legal paralysis. They believed that as a person of modest means, I could not withstand a protracted, expensive legal battle against a billion-dollar firm. They assumed the financial stress would break me. I looked directly at her. "You are welcome to try, Camilla. But I must advise you, my students were always taught to fear a teacher with a red pen. We are meticulous. We are exhaustive. And we know how to identify a flawed premise. Do you truly believe that in a court of law, a clause written and initialed by the deceased to protect the ethical values of his legacy will be deemed unconscionable, especially when the justification for contesting it rests on your public declaration that my life, the life of his wife of 50 years, was a taint?" I paused, letting the implications sink in. "You see, Camilla, you are arguing that Harold's final wish was flawed because it gave me the power to judge his own family's conduct. By calling me poverty and declaring me a taint, you've done precisely two things. You have activated the clause, and you have provided the necessary evidence for its activation. You have, in essence, handed me the very weapon you fear most." Mr. Finch quickly pulled out a notepad and began scribbling furiously. He was a lawyer, and the prospect of a high-stakes ethical and fiduciary battle, especially one with such colorful, damning testimony, was clearly outweighing his desire for a simple afternoon. Bryce finally found his voice, a low, desperate plea aimed only at me. "Mom, please. Let's talk about a buyout. We can give you $50 million, no, $75 million, tax-free. You can have the house, the vacation home, everything you could possibly want. You can retire in luxury, travel the world, and never worry about anything again. Just sign over the executive trustee role to me." His offer was staggering, an obscene acknowledgement of their panic. The sheer size of the number confirmed that the power I held was exponentially greater than anything they could publicly admit. $75 million. "Bryce," I said, my voice reflective, not greedy. "A handsome sum. You are attempting to buy my silence, my dignity, and the moral core of your father's final testament. But Harold didn't entrust this to me so I could sell it. He entrusted this to me so I could protect it." I picked up the teacup, my hand now perfectly steady. I took a slow, deliberate sip, my gaze unwavering as I looked over the rim at the two anxious faces opposite me. "The answer is no, Bryce. And now I believe we are done with the pleasantries. Mr. Finch, I require the full original trust document, 2 copies of the firm's most recent balance sheets, and the current operational plan that Bryce and Camilla have been pushing. I want these documents delivered to my house by 5 p.m. today. I will review them over the next 72 hours. Until then, nothing moves. I am the executive trustee, and the firm is now under immediate ethical review." I stood up, my old wool coat suddenly feeling like armor. I didn't wait for a response. I merely turned and walked toward the exit. Leaving the cold lilies and the terrified silence of the room behind me, as I reached the door, I heard Camilla's high, frantic whisper to Bryce, "What have you done?" I paused, half-turned, and spoke loudly enough for both of them and the frantic Mr. Finch to hear. "I haven't done anything, Camilla. But I have realized that my late husband, the brilliant man who loved me, foresaw this very moment. He knew the true value of my life, the value of a teacher's eye for detail, a matriarch's judgment, and a wife's unshakable loyalty. And he gave me the power to ensure that his legacy, which was always built on respect, would never be tainted by your greed." I stepped out of the room into the chilly, late-afternoon Chicago light. The weight of the firm's destiny, the trust, and the billions of dollars now rested squarely on my shoulders. I was alone, facing the most powerful people in my family. But for the first time in 3 days, I didn't feel broken. I felt alive. The drive back to my modest house on the North Shore felt surreal. I sat in the cab, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the familiar streets, attempting to reconcile the quiet reality of my life with the legal earthquake I had just triggered. My simple existence, gardening, tutoring, reading poetry, was now overlaid with the cold, hard logic of billions of dollars and international finance. When I arrived home, the peace of my small garden seemed to mock the tension coiled in my stomach. The scent of damp soil and late-blooming chrysanthemums offered a brief, comforting illusion that nothing had changed. But everything had. Precisely at 5 o'clock, a sleek, black sedan pulled up to the curb. Mr. Finch did not deliver the documents himself. Instead, a nervous young associate, clutching a leather briefcase, hesitantly approached my door. He was pale and clearly terrified, the kind of corporate drone who had never expected to encounter anything outside the safety of his spreadsheets. "Mrs. Thorne," stammered, holding out the briefcase as if it contained a bomb. "These are the documents you requested. Mr. Finch instructed me to deliver them personally, and to convey his sincere apologies for the day's unfortunate unpleasantries." I accepted the briefcase, noting the weight and the expensive leather. I saw the associate's eyes quickly scan my modest porch, my peeling paint, and my old reliable sedan in the driveway. He was taking inventory, confirming the disparity that Camilla had so viciously highlighted. "Thank you, young man," I said, offering him a warm, genuine smile that seemed to confuse him. "You may tell Mr. Finch that I appreciate his promptness, and I am quite certain that the unpleasantries are far from over. Good evening." I closed the door gently, leaving him standing bewildered on the porch. The briefcase lay on my kitchen table, stark metallic intruder against the familiar chipped formica. I opened it and spread the contents across the table, transforming the space where I usually graded essays into a war room. The documents were overwhelming. The trust, hundreds of pages thick. 2 massive financial reports detailing assets, liabilities, and complex offshore holdings. And Bryce's proposed operational plan, the key document. I knew they had been desperate to execute before I had time to think. I brewed a strong cup of Earl Grey, put on my reading glasses, and began. I wasn't a financial expert, but I was something arguably more dangerous. An English teacher with 40 years of practice in deductive analysis and the relentless pursuit of context. I didn't need to understand derivatives. I needed to understand the narrative they were trying to construct. I needed to find the inconsistency, the omitted adverb, the dangling participle of greed. Hours melted away. I cross-referenced the trust's fiduciary duties with the firm's current asset allocations. I compared Harold's conservative, long-term philosophy embedded in old memos and notes I had saved with the aggressive short-term, debt-fueled expansion detailed in Bryce's plan. The financial reports were indeed complex, filled with bewildering acronyms and dizzying numbers, but a pattern slowly began to emerge. Bryce's operational plan was centered on a series of highly leveraged acquisitions, buying up smaller, struggling firms using massive amounts of short-term borrowed capital. The goal was clearly to inflate the firm's size quickly, making it attractive for a massive immediate sale. The key to the whole scheme, I found, was the Wexford acquisition. This was a small, high-risk tech fund that Harold had always avoided, calling it unstable and ethically compromised. Bryce's plan proposed using 70% of the firm's liquid assets and significant new debt to finalize the Wexford deal within the next 90 days. The documents were intentionally complex, burying the true risk in pages of confusing projections. But I found the flaw not in the numbers, but in the language in the risk assessment section of Bryce's plan. A critical sentence noted that the Wexford acquisition was contingent upon the immediate sale of a non-core, high-value asset to shore up liquidity post-close. I flipped frantically through the balance sheets to identify the non-core, high-value asset. It wasn't a property or a portfolio. It was the controlling stake in Thorne Real Estate Holdings TREH, the subsidiary that owned the original debt-free, physical headquarters of Thorne Strategic Assets, the beautiful, Classic building Harold had founded the company, and my mind raced. Bryce and Camilla weren't just trying to inflate the company. They were trying to strip the core value out of the firm, selling the stable physical asset Harold treasured to fund a risky venture he always despised. And they needed to do it before anyone, especially the executive trustee, could properly vet the plan. The sale of the headquarters was slated for completion in 2 weeks. This realization sent a chill through me, far colder than Camilla's contempt. The insult of poverty was merely a tactic. The true goal was the immediate, reckless dismantling of Harold's life's work. This plan was not merely financially risky. It was a profound violation of the firm's moral and reputational interest. Harold, the man who believed stability and ownership were paramount, would have been horrified. This was the exact scenario the Legacy Veto was designed to prevent. I leaned back, rubbing my tired eyes. The complexity of the financial instruments was designed to overwhelm and confuse the inexperienced eye. But the sheer recklessness of the plan, the rush to sell the headquarters, the violation of Harold's known principles, these were the narrative clues that made the entire plot clear. They assumed I would see the big numbers, get distracted, and sign off out of confusion. They failed to realize I was trained to spot the omitted truth. I looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. I needed advice, but not from Mr. Finch, who was already compromised by his duty to the firm's operations. I needed a counter-strategy, and I needed it from someone outside the Thorn orbit, someone who understood both power and moral consequence. I pulled out Harold's old, leather-bound address book, the one he kept separate from the firm's digital network. My fingers found the name I was looking for, written in a slightly faded but firm script, accompanied by a number Harold had penned only 6 months ago. Sebastian Whitmore, the best outside counsel, trustworthy. I hesitated. Sebastian Whitmore. The name was legendary in Chicago finance, a formidable, ethical titan. I had met him fleetingly at a charity event years ago. Calling him now, late at night, felt like an act of desperation. But this was no longer about money. It was about legacy, and Whitmore was the one name Harold had specifically endorsed as a true guardian of values. I took a deep breath, the scent of the old paper and my husband's memory steadying me. I picked up the phone. I was tired, but the realization of their scheme had replaced my exhaustion with sharp, focused adrenaline. The English teacher was now ready to meet the Titan. The game had changed from defense to tactical offense. The next 72 hours would determine everything. My hand hovered over the phone, the cold plastic feeling heavy and immense. Calling Sebastian Whitmore, a figure of his stature, felt like stepping onto a stage I was utterly unprepared for. He wasn't just wealthy. He commanded respect with the quiet authority that financial giants acquire. Harold's note, trustworthy, was the only assurance I had. I dialed the number, my heart hammering a quick, nervous rhythm against my ribs. It rang only once before a deep, calm voice answered. Whitmore. Hello? No introduction. No automated message, just the efficient confidence of a man who answers his own calls at midnight. Mr. Whitmore, says Evelyn Thorne, Harold's wife. There was a brief telling silence on the line. Evelyn, I am so sorry for your loss. Harold was a man of immense integrity. He will be missed. His tone was instantly warm, but professional, acknowledging the gravity of my call. It's late. You wouldn't be calling unless it was absolutely critical. How can I help you? I took a deep breath and quickly summarized the day's events. The trust, the executive trustee role, Camilla's contemptuous public statement, the $75 million bribe, and, most importantly, the discovery of Bryce's aggressive operational plan and the imminent, reckless sale of the headquarters, the physical manifestation of Harold's legacy. I delivered the facts in a clear, concise manner, stripping away all emotion, presenting the situation as a detailed literary analysis of a complex plot. They are attempting to strip the value from the firm to finance a highly leveraged acquisition that Harold himself always opposed. And they are trying to rush the sale of the headquarters, a debt-free asset, before my 72-hour review period is complete, I concluded. They provided the reason for my veto in their insult, and they provided the financial evidence in their plan. Another long silence followed. I heard a slight rustling of paper on his end. Perhaps a notepad. "Evelyn," Sebastian finally said, his voice low and serious. "That is a brazen, calculated attempt at self-enrichment, disguised as operational efficiency. It violates every principle Harold stood for, and it confirms what I always knew about Camilla Devon's family. They are wolves." I was immensely relieved that he immediately grasped the ethical core of the crisis. He didn't ask for clarification on the financial terms. He focused on the intent. "You said Harold named you the sole executive trustee," Sebastian continued, "and you have a specific clause that allows you to veto the sale based on moral and reputational interest or a lack of professional respect." "Yes, Article 6, Section 3, a supplemental addendum. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant." Harold was always a step ahead, he murmured, a note of genuine admiration in his voice. "Evelyn, you are holding the single most powerful legal tool in that entire trust. It is a sword of Damocles hanging over their entire operation, and they are too blinded by greed to see it. They threatened legal action to argue my lack of experience in court." I told him, Sebastian chuckled, a low, powerful sound. "They will try, and they will fail. I will not allow it. I know the best legal teams in Chicago, and I assure you, a jury will side with the widow standing up for her husband's ethical legacy over the greedy son who insulted her poverty. That single comment, 'Your poverty will not taint this firm,' is their greatest error and your greatest strength." He shifted gears, his voice turning commanding, like a general preparing for battle. "Here is what we will do. You are tired, but we have less than 72 hours before they attempt to force your hand. First, you will do nothing. You will not communicate with Bryce, Camilla, or Mr. Finch. You are silent. You are studying the documents. You are the immovable object. Second, tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., I will dispatch my chief legal strategist, Nora Patel, and a forensic accountant to your home. Nora is formidable. She specializes in precisely this kind of white-collar financial warfare. She will review the documents and the trust in detail. Third, and this is crucial, we must find an immediate counter-leverage point. Bryce's plan is flawed. We will exploit that flaw. The sale of the headquarters, the TREH assetees central to their liquidity. We must stop that sale or acquire it ourselves." He paused, then added, "Evelyn, I want you to start thinking not just as a protector, but as a strategic investor. What is the cost of dignity? If you allow this to proceed, Harold's reputation is ruined. If you stop it, you save his soul. We need a solution that protects the legacy and punishes the lack of respect." "I don't want revenge, Mr. Whitmore," I confessed, the word feeling too heavy. "I just want Harold's principles to stand." "Justice, then," Sebastian corrected gently. "Justice, Evelyn, is expensive, but it is necessary. Rest now. When Nora arrives tomorrow, you will have the full support of my firm." They underestimated the wife. They will now face the matriarch, backed by Whitmore Capital. I hung up the phone, a strange electric feeling running through me. I hadn't just called a lawyer. I had activated an immense network of power. The documents on the table, the financial plans, the complex legal arguments, the betrayal no longer felt terrifying. They felt like the homework for a final, immensely important exam. One I was now fully prepared to ace. I pushed the papers aside, set the briefcase on the floor, and looked out the window. The moon was high, casting the shadows of the old oak tree across my lawn. They thought they could buy me, silence me, and sell Harold's life's work. They thought my life of poverty meant I lacked power. They were about to learn that the deepest wisdom, the most dangerous resilience often resides in the quietest, Most underestimated places, the battle for the Thorn legacy had entered its true phase, the counterattack, guided by the very words Harold Thorn had chosen to protect his wife. Part 6. The Betrayal in Black. Silk, your poverty will not taint this firm. I slept fitfully. The numbers and legal terms from the briefcase mingling with memories of Harold and the sharp, venomous sting of Camilla's insult. When the alarm sounded at 7, I was already awake, alert and focused. I dressed not in my usual comforting housecoat, but in a crisp, dark suit, the one I usually wore to my annual high school graduation ceremony. It felt professional, authoritative, and utterly devoid of the poverty Camilla had condemned. At 7:58 a.m., a sleek, unmarked black SUV arrived. Nora Patel, Sebastian Whitmore's legal strategist, was exactly as Sebastian had described, sharp, professional, and radiating quiet confidence. She was accompanied by a meticulous forensic accountant named David, whose eyes immediately locked onto the complex balance sheets spread across my kitchen table. Nora, a woman in her late 30s with a direct gaze, shook my hand firmly. "Mrs. Thorn, Mr. Whitmore has briefed me. We understand the urgency and we appreciate your clarity in diagnosing the problem. You correctly identified the core threat, the attempt to sacrifice the long-term ethical value of the firm for a short-term, reckless cash infusion." I handed her the trust and Bryce's operational plan. The weapon is the Legacy Veto. The target is the headquarters sale, and the evidence is Camilla's statement. I believe all three are connected. Nora spent the next few hours in relentless, quiet analysis. She didn't waste time on platitudes. She and David worked with astonishing efficiency, cross-referencing figures and legal footnotes. I watched them, offering coffee and occasional context, feeling an immense sense of relief that the overwhelming complexity was finally being handled by professionals who understood the language of finance. Mid-morning. Nora leaned back, pushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "Mrs. Thorn, your initial analysis was flawless. The Wexford acquisition is a black hole. It's designed to enrich a few early investors, likely including Camilla's family, before the fund inevitably collapses. To finance this, they must sell the headquarters tree. That building is a goldmine completely paid off, generating stable rent and representing stability. Selling it is an act of corporate self-sabotage." David, the accountant, chimed in. "The speed of the sale is the key. They need the liquidity immediately after the acquisition to cover debt service. If the TREH sale is blocked, the entire operational plan, the whole Wexford deal implodes." Nora fixed her gaze on me. "Your legacy veto is the nuclear option. If you invoke it, you freeze the sale of TREH and publicly expose their ethical malfeasance. But we need a strategic alternative. Something that protects Harold's legacy and establishes a non-disputable ethical standard for the firm's future." I thought back to the contempt in Camilla's eyes, the humiliation of being labeled a taint. "I don't want the firm destroyed, Nora," I said. "I want it redeemed. Harold built it on trust. I want the ethical violation addressed publicly, legally, and permanently. Then we need to use the veto to impose conditions on the trust. Not just stop the transaction," Nora countered, her eyes sparkling with strategic fervor. "We will draft a legal demand that serves as an ultimatum to Bryce and Camilla. It will state that the only way for the TREH sale to proceed, thus save their entire Wexford plan from implosion, is if they meet for non-negotiable conditions imposed by the executive trustee, Evelyn Thorn, under the authority of the Moral and Reputational Interest Clause." I smiled. This was the language I understood: conditions, consequences, and moral accountability. "What are the conditions?" I asked. Nora began listing them, her voice calm and absolute, translating my moral outrage into cold, hard legal reality. "Immediate dissolution of the Wexford acquisition plan. It must be publicly rejected as unethical and contrary to the firm's foundational values. Public acknowledgement of ethical misconduct. A full-page signed letter of apology must be placed in the Wall Street Journal and the Chicago Tribune, not just to me, but to the stakeholders of Thorn Assets, acknowledging the betrayal of trust and the attempt to undermine the firm's stability. The Ethics Endowment, Bryce must personally fund a $10 million non-disputable perpetual Harold Thorne's Business Ethics and Integrity Chair at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. This is the cost of the betrayal. Transfer of governance. Bryce must step down from all executive decision-making roles for 1 year, serving only in an advisory capacity, and transfer the right to approve all future major strategic decisions to a 3-person independent ethics review committee for 5 years. These conditions are non-negotiable, non-disputable. It must be met within 48 hours of delivery. Nora finished, closing her notepad with a decisive snap. They refuse, the veto remains in place, Trey stays put, and their entire leveraged scheme collapses, likely leading to their immediate professional ruin and possibly litigation from outside investors. The audacity of the demand was breathtaking. Didn't just stop the betrayal, it forced them to pay for it, publicly atone for it, and restructure the firm's governance to prioritize ethics over their own self-interest. It was a complete structural victory that cemented Harold's legacy. I stood, my gaze resting on the old familiar gold locket Harold had given me. "The conditions are perfect, Nora," I said, my voice strong. "It's not revenge. It's a necessary lesson in the weight of respect. Let them know the matriarch has spoken." The team went to work drafting the formal legal notice. I spent the afternoon rereading the trust, the words of the legacy veto now gleaming with power and consequence. I felt a surge of energy, not just from the legal victory, but from the immense dignity Harold had given me. He had known somehow that my strength lay not in the numbers, but in the unwavering clarity of my moral judgment. The battle of the betrayal in black silk was over. The stage was now set for the next confrontation, the delivery of the ultimatum, which would reveal to Bryce and Camilla the true scale of their $5 million mistake. The sun was setting, casting a fierce orange light through my kitchen window when Nora finalized the ultimatum. The document, printed on heavy legal paper bearing the austere letterhead of Whitmore Capital, was a masterful blend of legal force and ethical indictment. It detailed the activation of the moral and reputational interest clause, cited Camilla's precise phrase, "Your poverty will not taint this firm," as the evidence of ethical breach, and laid out the 4 crushing conditions for lifting the veto on the Trey sale. "We deliver this via secured courier to Bryce and Camilla's home at exactly 7 p.m. tonight," Nora instructed, securing the documents in a heavy, sealed envelope. "They will have 48 hours to sign, or the veto holds, and their entire plan is destroyed." I nodded, the gravity of the moment settling in. This was the final, irreversible action. Just as Nora was about to leave, my doorbell rang a loud, insistent chime that lacked all courtesy. I exchanged a look with Nora. She quickly moved behind the corner of the wall, out of sight from the door. I opened it to find Camilla, dressed not in black silk, but in an expensive, slightly rumpled trench coat, her face stripped of its practiced makeup. She looked disheveled, frantic, and utterly terrified. She pushed past me and stumbled into the kitchen, her eyes wide with panic as they scanned the room, missing Nora entirely. "Evelyn, you have to stop this. You have to call Mr. Finch and tell him to rescind the review. Bryce is losing his mind. The partners are already asking questions about the tree sale delay. They know something is wrong." She was frantic, clearly having abandoned all pretense of sophistication. She hadn't come to apologize. She had come to beg and intimidate, seeing me once again as the soft target. "Take a seat, Camilla," I said, my voice calm, indicating the seat by the briefcase. "The review process is ongoing. As executive trustee, I must protect Harold's legacy. Your behavior yesterday simply accelerated my timeline." "My behavior?" she shrieked, throwing her hands up. You're destroying Harold's company over a sentence? You are acting like a bitter old woman who just wants revenge, I said. Your poverty would taint. The ferment was an ugly thing to say. I regret the words, but it was true. You don't belong here. Her rage was blinding her to the presence of the sealed Whitmore envelope sitting openly on the table. I let her finish, observing the pathetic collapse of her dignity. It is precisely because I am an old woman who lives in poverty that I can see the truth, Camilla. I don't deal in billions, I deal in value. And the value you placed on my husband's ethics was zero. You proved that in the funeral parking lot, and you proved it again yesterday. You are not getting another penny from us. You are not getting our house. We will fight you until the bitter end. She threatened, her voice a raw scream. Just then, the back door, which I had forgotten to lock, creaked open. Bryce stood there, having slipped around the side of the house. He looked worse than his wife, his face haggard, his suit wrinkled. He wasn't angry. He was broken. Camilla, stop, he pleaded, his voice weak. Just stop. It's over. He looked at me, his eyes filled with genuine raw despair. Mom, I didn't know it was that bad. I just saw the money. I just saw the debt. I've been leveraged for months, trying to keep up with the Devons. I wanted the Wexford deal because I needed the commission to pay off my loans. I was drowning, and I thought you wouldn't notice. Thought you would just sign the papers and take the money. The admission of desperation changed the tone entirely. This was no longer a villain. This was a desperate, compromised son. You chose greed over your father's memory. Bryce, I said, the pain finally entering my voice. Nora stepped out from behind the wall, her presence immediately commanding attention. Camilla and Bryce jumped, startled, realizing they had been observed. Nora spoke in a cold, professional tone. Bryce, Camilla. I am Nora Patel, Chief Legal Strategist for Whitmore Capital. As Executive Trustee, Mrs. Thorne has engaged our firm to administer the Legacy Veto. This sealed document contains her final ultimatum imposed under the authority of the Moral and Reputational Interest Clause. You will receive an identical copy via courier in 5 minutes. You have 48 hours to sign. We advise you to read it very, very carefully. We also advise you to immediately secure all your personal accounts. We are not negotiating. Nora's voice, backed by the implicit threat of Sebastian Whitmore's immense financial power, achieved what my gentle words never could. Camilla dissolved into terrified sobs. Bryce simply stood, staring at the sealed envelope on the table. I walked to the table, picked up the sealed document, and held it out to Bryce. You will sign this, son. Not for me, but for Harold. This is the only way to honor his legacy. This is the cost of your silence and your wife's contempt. Bryce took the envelope, his hand shaking. He didn't open it. He just held the sheer weight of the impending consequences. The battle of the betrayal in black silk was officially closed. The true emotional reckoning had finally begun. The heavy, sealed envelope I had handed Bryce felt like a judgment carved in stone, not ink. He and Camilla stood paralyzed in my kitchen. The cheap Formica table suddenly transformed into the scene of their reckoning. I watched the absolute terror drain the color from Camilla's face. Not because she feared a mother-in-law's wrath, but because she feared the financial machine of Whitmore Capital that stood invisibly beside me. The humiliation was over. The consequences had arrived. Bryce, holding the ultimatum, finally dropped the pretense of the successful executive. He looked like the small boy who had broken a neighbor's window, not defiant, just caught. He was trapped between the crushing debt he confessed to and the ruinous terms of my legal demands. The silence was immense, broken only by Camilla's ragged, choked sobs. She wasn't mourning Harold. She was mourning the swift, unexpected collapse of her own luxurious future. 48 hours. Nora Patel's voice cut through the despair, crisp and uncompromising. The terms are absolute. No extensions, no negotiation. Mrs. Thorne's decision is final. With that, Nora gave me a swift nod and departed, leaving the couple to face the full, terrifying weight of the truth in the solitude of my modest kitchen. I looked at my son, then at my daughter-in-law. The compassion I felt was complicated a mother's pain mixed with a matriarch's unwavering resolve. I knew I could not yield, not an inch. Harold's principles and my own hard-won dignity were resting on this line of defense. "The back door is open, Bryce," I said softly, indicating the way he had entered. "Go home, read the document. Discuss it with your counsel, but know this, I am not selling my soul. Your father built that firm on honesty. That is the only thing I am trying to preserve." Bryce finally moved, slowly, stiffly, pulling Camilla by the arm. They didn't speak, they didn't look back. They left, disappearing into the twilight, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and fear. I stood there alone, leaning against the cold countertop, finally allowing the immense weight of the day to settle. I had not slept well in 3 days, and the adrenaline was now wearing off. Yet my mind was sharp, focused not on the immediate victory, but on the information that still haunted me: the Wexford acquisition and the forced liquidation of the headquarters. The true scale of their financial recklessness was still an unfolding danger. I needed to understand the why, not the emotional why of Bryce's debt, but the technical why of the $5 million asset they were willing to sacrifice. The next morning, I dove back into the firm's documents. Nora and David were working remotely, preparing for the inevitable legal counterstrike. But I, the executive trustee, still held the most important weapon. Context: Bryce's plan had referred to the headquarters sale as the immediate liquidation of a non-core, high-value asset. That single detached phrase revealed the depth of their arrogance. The building, debt-free and generating stable income, was the bedrock of the firm's stability. To Harold, it was the physical testament to his success. To Bryce and Camilla, it was merely an account entry that needed to be balanced. A $5 million mistake they were forcing through. The term liquidation was particularly jarring. It implied desperation, a quick fire sale approach intended to bypass the proper valuation process. I found a supplemental memo buried deep within the operational plan, authored by a junior executive, detailing the proposed sale price for the TREH headquarters, $5.20 million. My eyes widened in shock. The building, in prime downtown Chicago real estate, had been independently valued by Harold himself only 18 months prior at nearly $10 million. They were selling Harold's cherished asset for barely half its value. A staggering $5 million dollar discrepancy, a colossal mistake in the financial sense, but a deliberate act of financial sabotage in the ethical sense. The junior memo explained the low price by citing the urgent need for immediate cash liquidity to cover the front end costs of the disastrous Wexford acquisition. They were not only throwing away Harold's principles, but they were literally throwing away $5 million of the firm's capital, just to move quickly and cover their own tracks. This was the core of their greed, and it gave me a critical new piece of evidence. I immediately called Nora Patel. "Nora, I have found a major discrepancy," I told her, my voice tight with cold realization. "The headquarters, TREH, is listed for an internal sale price of $5.2 million in Bryce's plan. I have a prior appraisal from Harold putting the value closer to $10 million. They are committing a $5 million financial error that directly benefits the fraudulent Wexford timeline." Nora's response was immediate and sharp. "That's not a mistake, Mrs. Thorne. That's grounds for a fiduciary lawsuit. A $5 million intentional undervaluation, rushed through without proper due diligence, demonstrates blatant financial negligence designed to benefit a separate high-risk venture. It gives us a new hammer." "How does this affect the ultimatum?" I asked. "It solidifies it," Nora explained. "Their entire defense that they were acting in the best financial interest. of the firm is now completely undermined by this $5 million loss. The court would immediately see this as self-dealing and malfeasance. We now have not just an ethical justification for the veto, but an indisputable financial justification as well. She paused, then added a critical piece of advice. Mrs. Thorne, the 48-hour clock is ticking. Bryce and Camilla will be in a complete panic. They cannot afford to let the Wexford acquisition fail. But they also cannot afford the $10 million ethics chair. They will try to find a weakness in our defense. They will look for any crack, emotional, financial, or personal, to break your resolve. Her warning was timely. The phone rung a number I didn't recognize. I answered. It was Mr. Finch, Harold's longtime counsel, his voice sounding weary and deeply distressed. Evelyn, thank God you answered. I've reviewed the Whitmore document. It's devastating. Legally bulletproof. The legacy veto is absolute. But the conditions, they are impossible. Bryce cannot personally fund a $10 million chair. He's underwater as it is, and the Devons won't help him now. You are asking him to sacrifice himself, his career, and his family's security. You are ruining him. I listened to the lawyer's plea, recognizing his genuine distress for Bryce, but also realizing his implicit bias toward the status quo. The idea that the powerful should always be protected. Mr. Finch, I replied calmly, Harold entrusted me with the moral and reputational interest of his legacy. Bryce, in his greed and silence, threatened that. He and Camilla publicly declared that my honest life would taint the firm. Now, the price for that lack of respect and financial sabotage is not vengeance, but redemption. The $10 million ethics chair is the cost of atoning for the $5 million mistake they were trying to force through. He sighed, a deep, defeated sound. But Evelyn, they are preparing their legal counter-argument that the ethics chair is purely retaliatory, punitive, and constitutes an overreach of your fiduciary duty. They will argue you are acting out of personal spite, not corporate stewardship. This was the crack Nora had warned me about. It's the attempt to twist my moral action into personal malice. Mr. Finch, I stated, my voice resolute, embodying the authority Harold had granted me. You know Harold's character? His final initialed clause established ethics as the primary consideration above finance. The chair is not retaliatory. It is the precise remedy for the ethical breach they committed. Furthermore, I have discovered a $5 million undervaluation in the proposed tray sale, which constitutes clear financial malfeasance. Tell Bryce that if they choose to fight the ultimatum in court, I will not only invoke the veto, but I will file a separate fiduciary lawsuit based on the $5 million loss. He will not only lose the firm, but he will face civil penalties that will ruin him absolutely. The ultimatum is his only path to solvency and dignity. The silence on the other end was absolute. I had just demonstrated that the humble English teacher was not only ethically superior, but also strategically lethal. Evelyn, I understand. Mr. Finch finally whispered, the fight completely drained from him. I will advise them to accept the terms. I truly believe you are their only chance at survival. I hung up, my hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the realization of the immense, terrible power I now wielded. I was no longer fighting for $5 million. I was fighting for the soul of a legacy. The second day of the 48-hour countdown had just begun, and the odds, once stacked against me, had decisively shifted the morning after my confrontation with Mr. Finch. The house felt strangely quiet, the calm before the inevitable storm of legal and financial maneuvering. Bryce and Camilla were holed up with their own legal team, agonizing over the impossible ultimatum. They knew the truth. My legacy veto, now backed by the threat of a fiduciary lawsuit over the $5 million blunder, left them no honorable escape. They had banked on my ignorance, and my unexpected competence had become their ruin. But the immense weight of the situation brought a profound exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep. It was the weariness of fighting a battle they should never have forced upon me. As I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the notes I'd made on the trust, my fingers traced the faded ink of Harold's signature. They saw me only as a high school teacher, a gentlewoman who handled literature and compassion. They had no idea I had spent decades training for this very crisis. Harold and I were not defined by the money he made, but by the intellectual partnership we shared. Before I became Evelyn Thorne, the dedicated English teacher, I had been Evelyn Carter, a determined, impoverished graduate student in linguistics who also desperately needed to pay her way through university. My specialization wasn't just grammar. It was forensic semantics, the precise, analytical study of language used in complex, often deceptive, legal and political texts. This was my secret weapon, the hidden skill that Camilla's arrogance had utterly dismissed. I didn't need a financial degree to see through their plan. I needed to be able to dissect the language of deceit. And for a brief, critical period of my life, I had applied that skill to the very world they inhabited. When Harold started Thorne's strategic assets 50 years ago, I didn't just cheer him on. I worked beside him. We were young and poor, and neither of us could afford to hire a full-time legal analyst. So I became one. Every critical contract, every complex international agreement, every foundational document that established the firm's ethos and legal structure, they all passed through my hands first. I wasn't a lawyer, but I was the firm's first, most meticulous paralegal and corporate linguist. My job was to find the loopholes, the semantic ambiguities, and the potential for ethical failure hidden within the legal jargon. I understood that in corporate law, the most powerful clauses are often the ones that are intentionally misplaced, subtly phrased, or disguised in dense, overwhelming context. It was I who had pushed Harold to include the unusual, highly subjective language in the firm's foundational documents. And it was I who had insisted on the final unnumbered, indebted paragraph in the Trust the Legacy Veto. Harold hadn't just initialed that addendum, as Mr. Finch had assumed. He had transcribed it. I had dictated the language word by word. Over dinner in our small apartment kitchen, ensuring it was legally sound yet philosophically absolute. We designed it specifically to protect the firm from one thing: the internal corrosion of greed masked as expediency. Harold knew better than anyone that if he ever died, the financial structure he built would only survive if his ethical values were explicitly and legally safeguarded. This realization wasn't an epiphany. It was a memory, a profound confirmation of my own competence. Camilla saw my teaching profession as a sign of weakness and my modesty as proof of my inability to handle billions. She failed to see that teaching English for 40 years is the highest possible training in critical thinking, textual analysis, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. I picked up the original trust document again. It felt less like a relic of grief and more like a detailed, shared memoir of my partnership with Harold. My fingers moved to Article 6, Section 3. The phrase demonstrates a profound lack of professional respect for the trustee or the foundational values of the firm. That one sentence was worth more than the $75 million they had offered to pay me off. It was the literary equivalent of a perfect narrative resolution, meticulously planted decades in advance. The Legacy Veto was not a mistake. It was the final deliberate word of a highly intellectual partnership, executed by the matriarch who wrote it. I smiled, a slow, cold expression of satisfaction. They wanted to argue that my lack of a Wharton degree made me unfit. I was prepared to demonstrate that my PhD in semantics and a deep, intimate understanding of every founding document made me the only person fit to execute this trust. The true genius of the clause lay in its reliance on respect. Respect is not quantifiable in financial terms, but it is instantly recognizable in human interaction. Camilla's statement, the single dismissive line that tainted the firm, was the semantic key that unlocked the entire mechanism of justice. It was a flawless application of cause and effect. where the violation itself provided the legal justification for the remedy. I knew that Bryce and Camilla, advised by their expensive legal team, would be poring over the trust right now, looking for precedents, for loopholes, for any legal way to dismantle the clause. They would find none. The clause was unique, intentional, and, most importantly, unassailable because it had been legally validated by a senior partner's initials 30 years before. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the structure of the trust, not for financial clarity, but for structural integrity, anticipating their lawyers' every linguistic attack. They would argue that trustee meant only the administrative function, not the personal office. I had insisted Harold include a precise definition of the executive trustee's role that encompassed moral stewardship. They would argue the clause was unenforceable due to vagueness. I had insisted the clause be linked directly to the firm's explicitly written founding charter, which enshrined integrity and client respect as non-negotiable values. Every line of defense I was building was not based on current financial law, but on the enduring power of language and textual analysis. I was using the matriarch's hidden skill, the forgotten expertise that had once helped Harold build his billion-dollar empire. I was more than just an English teacher. I was the firm's founding linguistic architect. This realization brought an immense sense of peace. My dignity was not restored by a check. It was restored by the validation of my own intelligence. The irony was exquisite. The quality they ridiculed my focused. Intellectualism was the very thing that would now ruin their plan. I was ready. The phone rang again, pulling me back to the present. It was Nora Patel. Her voice was taut with urgency. Double quotes, Mrs. Thorne, we have a problem. They are going public. Part 2. The widow's hidden skill. More than just an English teacher. Nora's voice, usually a model of calm, carried a distinct tremor of alarm. Mrs. Thorne, Bryce's counsel is attempting to discredit you before the 48 hours is up. They've leaked a statement to the Chicago Business Review and Bloomberg suggesting that the current delay in the Wexford acquisition is due to an administrative hiccup caused by the uninformed and emotionally volatile intervention of a third-party trustee. They are publicly framing the Legacy Veto as a senile, personal act of vengeance. This was their counterattack, cold and predictable. They couldn't break the veto legally, so they were trying to break me reputationally. They were trying to rally public opinion and the firm's executive partners against the unstable widow. They were weaponizing the perception of my poverty and lack of corporate experience to make me seem unfit and dangerous. And what is their next move? I asked, my voice steady, the adrenaline returning. The emotional manipulation only hardened my resolve. They are using the leak to demand an emergency session of the firm's senior partners and legal counsel for this afternoon. They will force a vote of no confidence to strip you of the executive trustee power, arguing that your actions constitute gross professional negligence detrimental to the firm's financial security. The Wexford acquisition must close, they will argue, or the firm will face devastating penalties. This was the trap. If I attended, they would use the forum to humiliate me with financial jargon I couldn't immediately refute, solidifying the image of the uninformed trustee. If I refused, I would appear erratic and avoidant, bolstering their case for gross professional negligence. We have to anticipate their language. Nora, I said, instinctively falling back into my analytical role. They won't focus on the ethics chair. They will focus on the $5 million undervaluation, the loss of capital they are incurring because the TREH sale is blocked. They will frame that as my negligence. Precisely, Nora confirmed. They will use the $5 million loss against you. We need to frame the situation before they do. We need to introduce your history, your competence, before they can establish your image as the emotional, unstable outsider. I took a deep breath. This was the moment to reveal the hidden skill, the forgotten history. Nora, listen closely. I want you to leak a counterstatement immediately to the press, not to the Financial Wire, but to the Chicago Tribune's editorial desk. Tell them the truth, but frame it in my language. The leak must contain 3 specific facts, strategically chosen to undermine their claim of my ignorance. I began dictating, my mind working with the surgical precision of a linguist dissecting a fraudulent text. First, state that the executive trustee, Evelyn Thorne, is acting under the specific legal authority of the moral and reputational interest. Clause of provision personally drafted by her and the late Harold Thorne to prevent the ethical and financial collapse of the firm. Second, immediately refute the claim of negligence by stating the delay is to prevent a $5 million loss due to the blatant undervaluation of the Trey headquarters, which the executive trustee uncovered through meticulous due diligence. This shifts the negligence accusation back onto Bryce. Third, and this is the crucial part, mention that the trustee's competence stems from her background as the firm's first ever corporate paralegal and linguistic strategist during its founding years. Use the word linguist. Do not use English teacher unless absolutely necessary. This establishes my expertise in document structure, not derivatives. Nora was silent for a moment, her surprise palpable even over the phone line. Mrs. Thorne, a linguistic strategist. This is incredible leverage. They thought they were dealing with Shakespeare. We're hitting them with Clausewitz. The sudden reveal of your history will completely neutralize their uninformed widow narrative. It's the truth, Nora, I stated firmly. They thought my life was a taint. I am about to demonstrate that my true history is the founding cornerstone they forgot to account for. Go, leak the statement. Set the record straight. I will not be defined by their contempt. I will be defined by Harold's trust and my own enduring competence. Nora agreed, and the call ended. I knew the next few hours would be a media frenzy, a frantic clash of narratives. Bryce and Camilla were trying to force the $5 million mistake through with speed and distraction. I was countering it with the cold, hard certainty of my hidden skill and the undeniable power of textual evidence. I looked at the old, simple house around me. They had mocked my poverty, but my life, built on honesty and intellectual rigor, was proving to be a stronger foundation than their leveraged acquisitions and fragile prestige. I was the matriarch, armed with language. And the final script for Harold's legacy was now firmly in my hands. The immediate aftermath of Nora's press leak was a stunning explosion of quiet fury. Bryce and Camilla's attempt to brand me as an uninformed, emotional third party was instantly deflated by the counter-narrative. The executive trustee, a linguistic strategist and founding corporate paralegal, was blocking a massive financial maneuver to prevent a $5 million loss and uphold the ethical charter she herself had helped create. The phone in my house began to ring relentlessly, but I kept it silent. The emergency meeting of the senior partners, which Bryce had intended to be my execution, was now his reckoning. The partners were scrambling not to defend him, but to understand who this Evelyn Thorne truly was, and how she knew more about the firm's true financial standing than their own CFO. They had never known about my history, carefully hidden to maintain Harold's image as the sole genius. Now, that quiet partnership was saving his legacy. I sat alone, preparing for the meeting, the physical confrontation that Nora strongly advised I attend. She insisted that my presence, armed with the precise language of the trust, would immediately negate any attempt at a no-confidence vote. I dressed. The morning light caught the gold locket I always wore, the one Harold had given me on our 10th anniversary. Inside was not a photograph, but a tiny, tightly rolled scroll of paper, a habit Harold and I had for keeping important symbolic truths close. I removed the scroll and unrolled the delicate paper. It wasn't a poem, but a single, meticulously handwritten sentence from the early 1970s. Penned by Harold after a particularly brutal legal battle that nearly destroyed the fledgling firm. He had learned then that the biggest threat to integrity comes from within, not without. The sentence read, "Ethos is non-negotiable, and the final judgment rests with the matriarch." This was the philosophical cornerstone that had inspired the Legacy Veto. It was the reason I had insisted the Clause B placed outside the numbered financial sections. It was a moral law, not a fiscal policy. I remembered the day I drafted the clause 30 years ago. Harold was tired, recovering from a minor health scare. We were discussing estate planning, not because he feared death, but because he feared the disorder that follows it. He had specifically pointed to his own family, his distant, greedy relatives, and said, "Evelyn, when I'm gone, they will see only the balance sheet. They will not see the cost of the soul. You must have the final, unassailable word." We had spent days reviewing the trust, looking for the perfect, unassailable legal spot. We deliberately buried the clause in Article 6, Section 3, a dense, technical section that Mr. Finch himself had initially overlooked. It was a classic linguistic trick, hiding the most critical information where the reader, expecting only dry financial detail, would skim fastest. The sheer boredom of the surrounding text was the perfect camouflage. The true brilliance, however, lay in the choice of words, notwithstanding the financial stipulations outlined above. This ensured the clause superseded all financial urgency, including the catastrophic debt that Bryce faced. If the proposed execution of said sale demonstrates a profound lack of professional respect for the trustee, was the personal insurance policy. It allowed me to use their contemptuous attempt at erasure Camilla's "Your poverty will not taint this firm" as the legal basis for the veto. It turned their verbal abuse into a fatal contractual breach. The legacy veto was not merely a legal clause. It was a preemptive judgment executed from beyond the grave, and triggered by the very act of disrespect it was designed to prevent. I felt a surge of cold, focused determination. They had called me unsuited for the boardroom. I was about to walk into that boardroom and demonstrate a level of strategic foresight and intellectual rigor that none of them possessed. My phone rang. It was Nora Patel. "Mrs. Thorne, the emergency meeting has been called for 2 p.m. at the headquarters. Bryce's team is walking in with a stack of signed statements from junior partners claiming you've paralyzed the firm. They plan to use the full weight of the Wexford acquisitions collapse to argue negligence. They are terrified, and now they are cornered. They will be brutal." "Then we must be brilliant, Nora," I replied, my voice firm. "We will not argue the financial points. We will argue the semantics of the trust. Have Mr. Whitmore or a senior partner join us. Their presence is the physical manifestation of the power that is backing the legacy veto." "Mr. Whitmore is already en route, Mrs. Thorne," Nora confirmed. "He wants to witness this personally. He says this is the most elegant piece of estate planning he's seen in 20 years. I smiled. Validation from Sebastian Whitmore was worth more than Camilla's entire jewelry collection. "Good," I said. "Nora, I want you to prepare 2 things. First, a blow-up of the legacy veto clause, highlighted and displayed on the screen. Second, a transcription of Camilla's precise statement from the first day, highlighted in a separate document. We will not use it yet, but we will have it ready. We are going to teach them the precise legal weight of contempt." I placed the tiny scroll back into the locket, securing the philosophical core of my strength. I looked at myself in the mirror. I saw not the frail widow, but Evelyn Thorne, the matriarch, the linguistic strategist, prepared to fight for her husband's honor with the most powerful weapon of all, the truth, meticulously phrased. The stage was set for the corporate board humiliation. Part 2. The Buried Clause, Discovering the Legacy Veto. The Thorne Strategic Assets headquarters, the building they had tried to sell for half price, was a triumph of classic Chicago architecture. It was a space Harold loved, solid, quiet, built on debt-free stability. As Nora, Sebastian Whitmore, and I walked through the towering glass doors, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Security guards looked nervous. Junior staff avoided eye contact. Everyone knew the firm's future hinged on this. Afternoon's emergency meeting. The boardroom was a gleaming expanse of polished marble and cold steel. Gathered around the immense table were the firm's senior partner Stiff, Anxious men and women who dealt in certainty, now facing the ultimate uncertainty. Bryce and Camilla sat together, flanked by two highly paid, hostile-looking lawyers. Bryce looked exhausted. Camilla looked venomous, her composure utterly fractured. The room fell into a tense, immediate silence when Sebastian Whitmore entered. His presence was a seismic event. He took a seat next to me, a quiet, powerful endorsement of my actions. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His mere presence spoke volumes. The matriarch is not alone, and she is backed by a financial titan. The meeting began with Bryce's lead counsel, Mr. Alan Drake, a man known for his aggression, immediately launching his attack. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because the executive trustee, Mrs. Evelyn Thorne, has paralyzed this firm, inflicting massive financial damage under the guise of an emotional vendetta. The delay in the tray sale has jeopardized the critical Wexford acquisition, risking millions in penalties. We demand an immediate vote of no confidence and the appointment of an experienced interim trustee. He droned on, using technical jargon and inflated rhetoric, deliberately trying to overwhelm the room and paint me as the reckless outsider. He never once mentioned the legacy veto, focusing only on the financial risk of my actions. When it was my turn, I didn't reach for a financial report. I opened my small leather portfolio and calmly pulled out a single sheet of paper. I find the language used by Mr. Drake, specifically his claim of emotional vendetta, to be predictable and inaccurate. I began, my voice clear and steady. I did not act out of emotion. I acted under the explicit legal authority granted to me by Harold Thorne, the founder of this firm, under the moral and reputational interest clause of the trust, a clause which, I might add, I personally drafted. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Bryce and Camilla gasped. The senior partners exchanged shocked glances. The claim of me being a linguistic strategist had been a rumor. Now it was a matter of record, stated in the presence of Sebastian Whitmore. Mr. Drake, flustered, tried to interrupt. The clause is vague, Mrs. Thorne. It is unenforceable sentimental drivel. Is it, Mr. Drake? I countered, looking directly at the senior partners. Or is it a meticulously crafted legal mechanism designed to protect the very values you claim to uphold? Nora, if you please. Nora immediately projected the highlighted blow-up of the legacy veto onto the immense screen behind Mr. Drake. The paragraph, buried in dense text, now stood alone, glowing with clarity. The executive trustee reserves the absolute, non-revocable, non-disputable right to unilaterally veto any proposed extraordinary liquidation or sale of the controlling interest, if, in the executive trustee's sole and absolute judgment, said action is deemed to be against the moral and reputational interest of the Thorne legacy, or if the proposed execution of said sale demonstrates a profound lack of professional respect for the trustee. I want you to note two critical linguistic markers, I explained, pointing to the screen. First, the use of notwithstanding and non-disputable, which makes the veto impervious to financial urgency. Second, the trigger mechanism, lack of professional respect. I did not invent this condition. Harold Thorne did. I am merely the executor of his final ethical will. I turned to Bryce and Camilla. Mr. Drake claims I am motivated by revenge, but I am merely using the evidence that was so carelessly provided to me. The evidence that demonstrates a profound and fundamental lack of professional respect for the matriarch and the foundational values of this firm. I nodded to Nora, who then projected the second document onto the screen. Camilla's exact, unedited, damning statement. Highlighted in scarlet, Camilla Devon, August 12. Your poverty will not taint this firm. The room went silent. A vast, cold expanse of shattered composure. The partners finally saw the truth. This was not a financial battle. It was a moral indictment. The contemptuous attack on the widow's dignity had been weaponized into an unassailable legal defense. Mr. Drake, defeated, tried one last argument. Even if the clause is valid, Mrs. Thorne. The conditions for the veto, the $10 million ethics, punitive and excessive. They are clearly retaliatory. I looked at the senior partner who headed the firm's auditing division. On the contrary, Mr. Smith, the $10 million chair is the precise remedy for the ethical and financial damage attempted. Bryce and Camilla's plan involved selling the headquarters for a $5 million undervaluation. They were willing to sacrifice $5 million of the firm's capital to accelerate their personal acquisition scheme. The ethics chair is simply ensuring that money is reinvested into the firm's ethical and educational future, rather than being sacrificed for short-term greed. I am not being punitive. I am enforcing fiscal responsibility and moral accountability. The logic was flawless. The moral high ground, the legal authority, and the financial facts were all on my side. The partners looked from the projected text to Bryce's ashamed face, to Sebastian Whitmore's silent, confirming presence, the senior auditing partner. Mr. Smith stood up slowly. Mrs. Thorne, I move that the emergency vote be canceled. The executive trustee has demonstrated superior due diligence and unassailable legal grounds. We accept her findings and will comply with her ethical remediation requirements. The motion passed with immediate, unanimous support. Bryce's final attempt to strip me of power had failed. He was defeated, not by numbers, but by the weight of his father's final, buried word. The resolution in the boardroom, though unanimous and decisive, felt less like a victory and more like a definitive silence falling after a terrible crash. Bryce and Camilla were crushed, their faces etched with the profound, devastating realization that their entire, meticulously planned scheme had been demolished by the woman they considered insignificant. The partners, having hastily voted to comply with the legacy veto and the ethical remediation plan, filed out quickly, eager to distance themselves from the catastrophic failure. I remained seated at the head of the table. The glow from the projector screen, which still displayed Camilla's damning quote illuminating the wreckage of their ambition. My fatigue was immense, but it was overshadowed by a quiet, deep satisfaction. Justice, when executed with precision and undeniable evidence, felt surprisingly clean. Sebastian Whitmore, who had been my silent, unwavering cornerstone, finally spoke, his voice low and rich in the empty room. That Evelyn was a clinic in strategic deployment. You didn't just win the fight. You won the war for Harold's soul. You used their language, their contempt, and their carelessness to ensure their moral bankruptcy was exposed and corrected. Sebastian's presence in the room had been a masterstroke of political theater. He had not needed to utter a single word of legal advice. But his quiet arrival, the mere fact that a titan of his standing was there, validating the matriarch's authority, had paralyzed the senior partners and utterly defeated Bryce's legal counsel. The message was clear: challenge Evelyn Thorne, and you challenged Sebastian Whitmore. I merely executed the strategy Harold and I drafted decades ago. I replied, allowing myself a small, weary smile. The legacy veto was always meant to stand guard against the erosion of trust. I am grateful for your presence, Sebastian. You gave the veto the necessary force. He stood and walked around the table, stopping beside me. He placed a strong, warm hand lightly on my shoulder. I did it for Harold, Evelyn, and I did it for the principles that man embodied. But I also did it for you. You deserve to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected, not just as Harold's wife, but as the brilliant woman you are. His gaze was gentle, focusing not on the legal documents scattered across the table, but on the strength he recognized in my face. He looked at me with an acknowledgement of my intelligence and resilience that went far beyond the corporate crisis. It was a look I hadn't seen since Harold was a Leva, look that saw the Evelyn beneath the matriarch. I felt a sudden, profound rush of emotion, the accumulated stress of the past week finding an outlet. I am tired, Sebastian. They drained everything. The constant fight, the realization of my son's compromise. It's over now, he assured me, his voice a steady anchor. The legal fight is finished. Bryce has no choice but to comply. The Ethics Endowment and the public acknowledgement are mandatory. Now, you must focus on the second phase, the healing. I looked across the table at Bryce and Camilla, who were still sitting utterly defeated, their lawyer frantically trying to salvage the remains of the situation. Their humiliation was complete, but the emotional cost to me was immense. I have to talk to Bryce, I stated, not as the executive trustee, but as his mother. I need to understand his compromise, not just his greed. Sebastian nodded, understanding the delicate line I was walking. I'll wait outside, Evelyn. But let me leave you with one final piece of strategic advice. You have won the war of authority. Do not relinquish that authority in the conversation of reconciliation. Forgiveness must follow humility, not precede it. He must understand that the price of respect is earned, not simply granted. He squeezed my shoulder lightly and walked out of the boardroom, leaving me alone with my son and his shattered wife. His quiet arrival had won the legal battle. His quiet departure left me to face the personal one. I stood and slowly walked toward Bryce. His lawyer was packing his briefcase, clearly preparing for the mandatory compliance that lay ahead. Camilla sat rigidly, refusing to look up. Bryce, however, finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. They were red, raw, and filled with a despair that pierced my heart. Bryce, I began, my voice softer now, stripped of the legal steel. I want his lawyer to step outside. I want his wife to listen. This conversation is not about the trust. It is about the legacy of us. Mr. Drake hesitated, but Bryce, with a defeated wave of his hand, told him to wait in the hall. Camilla, stiff and defiant, remained glued to her chair. You have signed the ultimatum. Bryce, I stated, though I knew the physical signing was still days away. You have no choice. The Ethics Endowment is the path to your survival. But I want to know, son, why? Why would you dismantle your father's life's work? Why did you compromise the only thing he ever asked you to protect, his integrity? Bryce finally broke. The strong, tailored executive dissolved into a heartbroken, debt-ridden man. Mom, I am ruined, he whispered, the sound catching in his throat. I owe the Devons Associated Holding Companies nearly $4 million. It wasn't the commission I was after. It was the rescue. The Wexford acquisition was the only way out. I was leveraged on every side, trying to maintain the image, the house, the memberships. The life Camilla demanded. Camilla finally looked up, her denial transforming into furious defensive shame. I demanded nothing, Bryce. You chose this. You wanted the power. You wanted the applause. I wanted your respect. Bryce shouted, slamming his hand on the table. I wanted the respect of the partners who only saw me as Harold's lesser son. I thought if I pulled off the biggest deal in firm history, they would finally see me. And when you insulted Mom, I couldn't speak. Because I knew the only way to save my own skin was to let you silence her and push the sale through. His confession was devastatingly painful. It wasn't just greed. It was insecurity fueled by enormous pressure. He had sacrificed his mother's dignity and his father's principles to appease his own crippling sense of inadequacy and the relentless, expensive demands of his lifestyle. Your father never saw you as lesser. Bryce, I whispered, tears finally blurring my vision. He saw you as his legacy, the one who would carry on his values. He never cared about the size of the deal. He cared about the honor of the contract. I pointed to the projected quote on the screen, Camilla's brutal judgment. This is the rot that destroyed your judgment, Bryce. You let the quest for money corrupt your conscience. But now you have a chance to redeem yourself. Not with money, but with action. I outlined the steps I wanted. Not as the trustee, but as his mother. A sincere, private apology to Harold's memory. A full confession to the family's independent financial advisor. And a genuine commitment to the ethical principles of the endowment. You will comply with the ultimatum, Bryce, I concluded, my voice firm. You will fund the ethics chair. You will step down from operational control for 1 year. And volunteer with one of the firm's charitable foundations. You will learn the true value of respect, not the price of a short-term deal. And only then will the process of my forgiveness even begin. Camilla, realizing the depth of her own complicity and the total collapse of her power, finally rose, defeated. She understood that her marriage and her life were now subject to the iron will of the woman she had mocked as poverty. I watched them leave the boardroom, the scene of their defense, finally allowed myself to sink back into the chair. The battle was won. Harold's legacy was safe. And the matriarch, having wielded the law with the precision of a scholar, had secured not just the fortune, but the honor of her family. The finality of the boardroom confrontation left a profound silence in its wake. Bryce's broken confession, the revelation that he was drowning in debt and driven by insecurity. Not just sheer malice did not erase his betrayal, but it complicated the narrative. My victory was now complete. The legacy veto was unchallenged, and the conditions for the Ethics Endowment were set. But now came the heavy work of enforcement. Justice, as Harold always taught me, is not merely about finding the truth. It is about establishing a price that ensures the lesson is permanent. The $10 million ethics chair was the core of my ultimatum, the non-negotiable cost of their attempted corporate sabotage and the public insult. But the true overall cost of their redemption, the full price of undoing their $5 million mistake, was far greater. The total financial damage and the required ethical remediation amounted to a stunning $18 million. In mandated investment, lost capital, and penalties. I sat with Sebastian Whitmore in my small living room later that evening. The heavy legal documents replaced by 2 cups of black coffee. The gravity of the number $18 million was immense. They will fight the $10 million. Evelyn, Sebastian warned, his gaze thoughtful. They will try to argue that, while the legacy veto is legally sound, the financial consequence is disproportionate to the ethical breach. They will try to bargain you down to $3 million, perhaps $5 million. That is their final tactical play. They will fail, I stated. My voice steady. I felt no greed, only a cold clarity. The $10 million is not a punishment for the insult. It is the necessary reinvestment into the firm's ethical future that they jeopardized, and I have the leverage to ensure they pay it in full. I explained my strategy to Sebastian, using the financial facts Nora and David had uncovered. The immediate necessity for Bryce was to proceed with the Trees 11 at a reduced valuation to shore up liquidity and prevent the disastrous leveraged Wexford acquisition from defaulting. But the legacy veto still blocked that sale. The veto is the wall, Sebastian. But the $18 million is the only door, I explained. They were attempting to sell a $10 million asset for $5 million, creating a $5 million loss. The $10 million endowment is double that loss, ensuring that the penalty is felt, but that the firm benefits from their failure. It transforms their selfish mistake into a permanent public good. Sebastian nodded, impressed. You've engineered a brilliant piece of non-punitive justice, Evelyn. You are forcing a capital injection where they intended a capital drain. This is why Harold trusted your judgment above all others. But there was still the personal debt. Bryce confessed nearly $4 million he owed to the Devons holding companies. If he paid the $10 million endowment, he would be financially ruined, unable to pay off his own crippling loans. His path to redemption would lead to his absolute professional and personal collapse. Justice cannot lead to utter ruin, Sebastian, I said, looking out at the familiar, comforting shadows of my garden. If Bryce is ruined, he will become bitter and the lesson will be lost. The $10 million is the cost of the firm's redemption. But his personal debt must be resolved in a way that allows him to build a new, honorable life. Sebastian looked at me, a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes. He had expected a matriarch focused on total financial dominance, not nuanced personal redemption. Then we must create a path where the firm itself helps him. Under strict ethical guidance, he mused, we can mandate that the firm buys out his personal debt at a reduced, structured rate, contingent upon his successful completion of the 1-year non-operational advisory role and his commitment to the ethics chair implementation. It links his personal solvency to his professional ethical compliance. Exactly, I confirmed. Justice is not cheap, but it must be precise. Bryce will understand that his freedom from debt is now irrevocably tied to his honor, not to his ability to cut a ruthless deal. The true counteroffer was thus finalized, a colossal $18 million cost to the Thorne family's ambition, comprising the $10 million ethics chair, the $5 million loss they incurred from their failed scheme, and the $3 million in professional fees and restructuring costs, designed to be borne by their financial maneuvering. But for Bryce, the individual, the path to a debt-free future was laid out, costing him his pride, but saving his soul. Part 2. The $18 million counteroffer. Justice is not cheap. The final, formal response from Bryce's counsel arrived 24 hours after the ultimatum was delivered, a day that felt like a year. It was a massive document, filled with legal arguments attempting to dismantle the legacy veto and desperately negotiate the terms of the Ethics Endowment. They proposed a $2 million donation over 10 years, suggesting the $10 million immediate payment was fiscally irresponsible. Nora and Sebastian had anticipated this precise reaction. They had already prepared the reply, a simple, unyielding confirmation that the initial terms were non-negotiable. They are trying to buy their way out with a cheap installment plan, Nora explained over the phone. They haven't grasped that this is not about money. It's about precedent. We hit them with the $5 million tree undervaluation again, reinforcing that they have already demonstrated their incapacity to make sound financial judgments. Therefore, the trustees' ethical mandate must stand. The final, devastating blow came not from me, but from Sebastian Whitmore. He personally called Bryce's lead counsel, delivering a concise, non-disputable message. The legacy veto is absolute. If you fight this, Whitmore Capital will publicly disclose the $5 million undervaluation in the TREH sale and assist Mrs. Thorne in filing a fiduciary lawsuit. Bryce will face ruin, and your firm will lose its license. The $10 million ethics chair is the only bridge back to solvency. Sign the papers. The power of Sebastian's name, coupled with the incontrovertible evidence of their financial malpractice, broke their resolve. Within the hour, Nora received the final confirmation. Bryce and Camilla had signed the entire ultimatum, the $18 million counteroffer, the sum total of their financial failure and ethical restitution had been accepted in full. The conditions were now legally binding. The immediate public rejection of the reckless Wexford acquisition, the establishment of the permanent $10 million Harold Thorne ethics chair, the year-long operational exile for Bryce, and the mandatory public acknowledgement of my authority and competence. Justice was not cheap, but it was now sealed. I looked at the documents confirming the signed compliance. I felt no jubilation, only a profound, weary sense of closure. The money was a symbol, but the real victory was the precedent. Harold's principles would now govern the firm, protected by the permanent ethics chair. That would bear his name and teach the very lessons his son had forgotten. The immediate crisis was over, but the personal journey of reconciliation still lay ahead. Bryce had chosen to survive with his dignity intact, but he had a long, difficult road to walk. The matriarch had imposed the price of justice. Now she had to navigate the cost of forgiveness. The signed compliance documents lay on my desk. Confirmation that the entire $18 million counteroffer was now legally binding. The battle for the trust was finished, but the final, necessary act of justice remained: the public acknowledgement of the firm's ethical failure. My ultimatum had mandated a formal, internal session where Bryce and Camilla publicly confessed their malfeasance to the senior partners who had once backed them. It was a mandatory ceremony of humility, designed to permanently etch the lesson of the legacy veto into the firm's culture. The session was scheduled for a week later, giving the lawyers time to prepare the documents and giving the firm time to absorb the staggering realization that their entire reckless strategy had been orchestrated by the founder's son. The atmosphere in the headquarters was glacial. Fear and resentment mingled in the hallways. The partners now saw me not as the fragile widow, but as the iron-willed matriarch who held the keys to their solvency. I arrived at the headquarters with Nora Patel. We were met by the lead auditing partner, Mr. Smith, the man whose vote had shifted the tide in the initial emergency meeting. He looked drawn and weary. Mrs. Thorne, the atmosphere is tense, Mr. Smith confessed, lowering his voice. Bryce has been completely stripped of his operational role. The partners are furious about the $10 million charge. But they are terrified of the fiduciary lawsuit you threatened. They know the cost of the Ethics Endowment is the price of their survival. Then they understand the weight of ethical stewardship. Mr. Smith, I replied, my voice calm. That is precisely the point of this session. We are not here for punishment. We are here for restoration, the restoration of Harold's values. The room for the confession was smaller than the main boardroom, more intimate and intensely focused. Seated around the table were the 7 most influential senior partners representing the core decision-makers of the firm. Bryce and Camilla sat at the far end, facing the partners, looking like defendants awaiting a verdict. Bryce's lawyer, Mr. Drake, tried one last attempt at damage control. Mrs. Thorne, my clients have complied with the settlement. I object to this public internal acknowledgement. It serves no legal purpose and is purely punitive. I ignored him, looking directly at the seated partners. Mr. Drake, this session is mandatory under the signed agreement. It is not punitive. It is the final, non-negotiable term of the Ethics Endowment, the required public acknowledgement that the firm's integrity was deliberately compromised. The partners must hear the truth to ensure this failure is never repeated. I turned to Bryce, who was pale, his hands clasped tightly before him. Bryce, your father trusted you to uphold this firm's honor. You instead chose to risk its entire foundation to satisfy a crippling personal debt. And your wife's demands for a lifestyle you couldn't afford. You will now confess to the partners the full specific extent of your malfeasance. Bryce began to speak, his voice a low, humiliated monotone. He confessed to personally signing off on the disastrous Wexford acquisition, knowing Harold had explicitly forbidden it. He confessed to the intentional $5 million undervaluation of the headquarters, designed to bypass due diligence and accelerate the timeline. He confessed to leveraging his personal debt against the firm's holdings, creating a conflict of interest that jeopardized their stability. His confession was agonizing in its detail, exposing not just a greedy plot, but a total collapse of professional and personal integrity. The partners listened in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of horror and cold calculation. They had suspected incompetence. They were now witnessing intentional sabotage. When Bryce was finished, the silence in the room was absolute. It was Camilla's turn. I looked at her, the woman who had publicly mocked my simple life, who had tried to erase me from the family and the firm. Her eyes were red, but still defiant. She did not want to speak. Camilla, I prompted, my voice calm but absolute. You will now acknowledge your role in this ethical breach. You will acknowledge that you exerted undue influence over your husband, leading to his compromise. And you will acknowledge your public statement that initiated the Legacy Veto. Part 2. The Corporate Board Humiliation. A Public Confession. Camilla hesitated, her pride warring with her fear of total social and financial ruin. She looked at Mr. Drake, who gave a minute shake of his head. He knew this was the final, inescapable cost of their freedom. She finally spoke, her voice thin and choked. I admit to pressuring Bryce regarding the acquisition. I wanted the financial standing it represented, she whispered, struggling to maintain a semblance of control. I was unaware of the full scope of his debt, but I certainly was aware of the need to maintain an image. And yes, she paused, taking a ragged breath, her eyes flicking to mine with a mixture of hatred and fear. I publicly stated my opinion that Evelyn's modest lifestyle was a liability to the firm's image. She stopped, but I intervened, demanding the full truth. You stated that my poverty would taint the firm, Camilla. You believed my life, The life of the founder's wife was a mark of shame. You will now acknowledge that this contempt for dignity triggered the very clause designed to protect the firm from your greed." Camilla swallowed hard, the humiliation burning in her eyes. "Yes," she choked out, the word barely audible. "I acknowledge that my contemptuous remarks were the precise grounds for the executive trustee's activation of the moral and reputational interest clause. I acknowledge that my judgment was flawed and that I was prioritizing image over integrity." The total collapse of her carefully constructed arrogance was complete. The partners now had the full, unvarnished record, the son's weakness, the wife's greed, and the matriarch's unwavering ethical defense. The public confession was not just a formality. It was a permanent collective memory for the firm. I concluded the session by addressing the partners, solidifying the victory. "You have heard the truth. Bryce is now formally stepping down from all operational duties for 1 year, beginning his advisory role, and complying with the Ethics Endowment payment schedule. The firm will now proceed with the immediate dissolution of the Wexford acquisition and a full internal audit. The Legacy Veto will remain in place, ready to be invoked again if the firm's ethical compass ever wavers. Harold Thorne's principles are not optional. They are the foundation." The partners rose, offering me sober, respectful nods. There was no joy in their compliance, only absolute acceptance of the new, stringent reality. The final moment of the confession was a private exchange with Bryce, as the partners filed out. He waited for me. His eyes were no longer defiant but filled with overwhelming remorse. "Mom," he whispered, "I am so sorry. For the debt. For the betrayal. For the words you had to hear." I looked at my son, the man who had chosen to save his life by sacrificing his pride. The Ethics Endowment would cost him dearly, but it would save him. "I hear your confession, Bryce," I said softly. "But remorse is not the end of the story. You will fulfill the terms of the Ethics Endowment. You will find the man Harold raised, and you will choose honor over ambition. The payment is made, but the forgiveness must be earned." I left the headquarters, the silent victory a heavy cloak around me. I had secured the financial justice, but the personal journey of reconciliation with my son was only just beginning. The price of their redemption was high. But the cost of the matriarch's peace was higher still. The corporate confession session was the legal climax. But the emotional resolution required a different kind of confrontation, one stripped bare of legal documents and partner scrutiny. I had demanded a private meeting with Bryce, just the two of us, back in my small house. The only place where the power of the matriarch yielded to the intimacy of the mother. He arrived 2 days later, not in a sleek executive sedan, but in an unmarked car. Cool. Looking entirely devoid of his usual corporate armor. The air between us was thick with the weight of unsaid things. He was the son who had almost ruined his father's legacy. And I was the mother who had saved it with a single, perfectly aimed clause. He carried the burden of the $18 million counteroffer, and I carried the sorrow of his betrayal. We sat in my living room, the same room where I had analyzed the fraudulent financial reports for a long time. Neither of us spoke. He looked at the familiar old photographs on the mantelpiece, a young Harold, proud and earnest, and a slightly younger me, full of hope. He avoided my eyes, the immense shame of his compromise, a physical presence between us. "The papers are filed." "Mom," Bryce finally murmured, his voice flat. "The Wexford acquisition is dissolved. The first payment toward the Ethics Endowment is scheduled. I'm starting my advisory role next week. It's done. The legal part is done, Bryce," I corrected gently. "The personal part is just beginning. I am not interested in the numbers now. I am interested in the truth of your compromise. Why did you choose to risk your father's soul for a short-term, reckless acquisition that he hated?" He flinched, the word soul cutting deeper than any financial penalty. "It wasn't just the money, Mom. It was the chains." He lifted his gaze, and the raw, desperate look in his eyes startled me. "The chains of debt. The chains of expectation. You and Dad lived simply. When I married Camilla, I bought into a world where simplicity was weakness and status was everything. We had the house, the memberships, the private schools, the charitable events, all necessary, Camilla insisted, to maintain the Thorn stature. He confessed that over the past 3 years, the pressure to maintain that facade had led him to take on dangerous, high-interest personal loans, often using the Devons-affiliated holding companies as brokers, a classic high-pressure tactic designed to trap him. I was leveraged on my salary, my future bonuses, even my stock options. I owed the Devons nearly $4 million, and they were tightening the screws. They threatened to expose my debt to the partners, to Harold's estate, to the press. They would have ruined me. The only way out was the massive commission and bonus from the Wexford deal. It was a lifeline they offered, knowing I was already drowning. His voice broke. When Camilla shamed you, I couldn't defend you because I needed her family's silence. I needed the deal. I had become their puppet, Mom. The firm wasn't just an inheritance. It was the mechanism I needed to save my life, even if it meant sacrificing its integrity. The revelation was devastating. It explained the frantic silence at the funeral, the desperate plea for a buyout, and the shattered look in his eyes. He wasn't the villain. He was the victim of a sophisticated, self-inflicted financial trap, one baited by his own insecurity. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked, the sorrow making my voice tremble. "Your father and I never cared about the facade. We would have helped you." "I couldn't," he whispered, shame washing over him. "I was supposed to be the successful heir, the man who could manage the billions. Admitting my debt, my failure to keep up would have meant admitting I wasn't worthy of the Thorn name, of your respect, or of Dad's trust. So I built a lie on top of a lie, and the Legacy Veto destroyed it all." I reached out and took his hand, the smooth, cold hand of the executive melting into the familiar, warm hand of my son. "The veto didn't destroy your life, Bryce. It destroyed the lie. It gave you a chance to rebuild your life on the true foundation of your father's values." Part 2. The son's truth. The chains of debt. The confession was a painful, necessary catharsis. Bryce had finally exposed the crippling chains of debt that had driven his compromise. The path to his professional redemption, the Ethics Endowment, was now clear. But the personal healing required a different kind of contract. The $10 million is the price of the firm's redemption. "Bryce," I stated softly, squeezing his hand, "but your personal freedom must also be secured. You cannot begin to live an honorable life if you are still trapped by the Devons' debt." I told him about the structural resolution Nora and Sebastian had planned. The firm, under my authority as executive trustee, would buy out his nearly $4 million personal debt at a reduced structured rate. This wasn't a gift. It was a strategically controlled repayment plan, contingent upon his continued ethical compliance. "You will be debt-free from the Devons, Bryce," I explained. "But the firm will hold your debt and you will repay it without interest over the next 5 years. You will be held accountable, but you will be free from the malice of your in-laws. Your personal solvency is now tied to your honor, not to a ruthless acquisition." Bryce stared at me, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this unexpected, life-saving intervention. He had expected to be ruined. I was offering him a path to financial freedom, bought with the currency of his own repentance. You're giving me a chance to start over," he choked out, tears finally streaming down his face. "You're saving my life, Mom." "I am saving Harold's legacy, Bryce," I corrected gently, "and you are a part of that legacy. But this freedom comes with permanent conditions: absolute transparency, a commitment to the firm's charitable foundation during your year of exile, and the ongoing, active implementation of the Ethics Endowment." We spent the rest of the afternoon going through the details of his plan for the year. He would step away from the executive suite and spend his time working with the foundation that provides educational support for underserved students, a deliberate echo of the public school life Camilla had mocked. He would learn the value of service, not status. "I want to be the man you and Dad were proud of, Mom," he promised, his voice filled with genuine humility. I will earn your forgiveness. I will make the ethics chair the most meaningful part of the firm." I looked at him, seeing the tired, honest man beneath the executive shell. He had been broken by the truth, but he was finally beginning to heal. The chains of debt were being replaced by the covenants of responsibility. As he left, he turned back on the porch. "Camila, she still doesn't understand, Mom. She just sees the money lost. She hasn't signed the papers for her own compliance." "Camilla's redemption is her own burden, Bryce," I replied. "The firm and the trust are secured. She can choose to comply with the terms of the settlement, or she can choose to live outside the boundaries of the Thorne family. That is her choice now. You, however, must walk your own path." I watched him drive away. The familiar grief for Harold now mingled with a cautious, fragile hope for my son. The legacy veto had worked. It had not only saved the firm, but had begun the long, agonizing process of saving the son who had almost betrayed it. The weight of my son's confession lingered in the air, heavy and heartbreaking. He was gone, taking his first tentative steps toward redemption, leaving behind the immense task of formalizing the very instrument of his survival: the Harold Thorne Business Ethics and Integrity Chair. This ethics endowment was not merely a financial penalty. It was the contractual framework for his forgiveness, a permanent, billion-dollar testament to the lesson that integrity transcends wealth. I spent the next several days working tirelessly with Nora Patel and Sebastian Whitmore's team, not on legal maneuvers, but on the charter of the endowment. This was my expertise translating profound ethical principles into clear, unassailable language. I wanted the charter to be more than a funding document. I wanted it to be Harold's living legacy, ensuring that the next generation of financial leaders would prioritize honor over expediency. The $10 million commitment was massive, but the true value lay in the details. We mandated that the chair would focus on fiduciary responsibility in the context of family, wealth, and ethical governance in succession planning. This was a direct, targeted rebuke to Bryce's failures. The ultimate goal, however, was to ensure the longevity of the lesson. Forgiveness is a contract. It requires two sides to commit to terms. Bryce's financial freedom from the Devons was tied to his active, demonstrable commitment to the endowment's success. He had to prove he was worthy of the clean slate I had given him. The first major act of my new authority was to formally launch the endowment at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, Harold's alma mater. This was a critical step in restoring the firm's public reputation and cementing Harold's values. I would attend as the executive trustee, the woman who had saved the firm from internal collapse. As I prepared for the ceremony, the phone rang. It was Camila. I hadn't heard from her since the boardroom confession. Her voice, usually sharp and demanding, was now strained and thin. "Evelyn, I am calling about the compliance papers," she began, immediately launching into a defense. "My lawyers advise me that the terms for my involvement, a mandatory volunteer hours with the firm's charity, and the public endorsement of the ethics chair are punitive. I am not an employee, and I will not be ordered to perform menial tasks." I listened patiently, recognizing the last vestiges of her pride fighting against absolute defeat. Camila finally replied, my voice steady. "The terms of the settlement are clear. The mandatory volunteer work is not punitive. It is the cost of your public acknowledgement of guilt. You benefited from Bryce's attempts to compromise the firm, and you profited from the contempt you showed me. The only way to show the firm that you accept the new ethical standard is to donate your time, not your money, to the community you mocked." She hesitated. "I cannot. My social calendar, it's impossible. Then you may choose not to sign the compliance papers." "Camila," I stated simply, "if you refuse, you will be formally excluded from all future family trust events. And your right to any financial benefit from the firm's success will be legally jeopardized. Your compliance is the only path back to the family table." I had given her the ultimate choice: her pride and social calendar, or her financial security and a chance at family reconciliation. I would not force her, but I would not yield on the terms of her redemption. She was trapped by the very contract I had established. She hung up without answering. I knew the silence meant she was weighing the immense cost of her arrogance against the even greater cost of being permanently exiled. The launch ceremony for the Harold Thorne Ethics and Integrity Chair was everything Harold would have respected, elegant, understated, and intensely focused on the idea, not the personalities. The deans of the business school spoke of Harold's unwavering principles, and Sebastian Whitmore gave a powerful, moving tribute to Harold's character, subtly referencing the necessity of fighting to protect a legacy. I stood at the podium as the executive trustee, the woman who had saved the firm. I didn't speak of the struggle, the debt, or the betrayal. I spoke only of the enduring power of language and trust. The most complex financial structures in the world are built on the simplest human contract. Trust, I stated, looking directly at the assembled students, faculty, and partners. This endowment is a commitment to teach future leaders that when faced with a moral crisis, they must not seek a legal loophole, but an ethical truth. The Harold Thorne share ensures that this firm's most valuable asset will always be its honor, not its latest acquisition. The ceremony was a resounding success, a powerful public declaration that the firm was under new management, the governance of integrity. The true moment of triumph, however, came later that evening. I was home, sitting by my window, when a battered envelope was slipped through my mail slot. It contained Camilla's compliance papers. Every line was signed, and a brief, stiff, handwritten note was attached. I accept the terms. I will begin the community service next week. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement of defeat and a contractual commitment to restitution. She had chosen to sign the contract of her forgiveness, but the most meaningful contract was the one I received from my son, Bryce. He didn't send legal papers. He sent a small, leather-bound notebook. Inside was a handwritten note. Mom, I've begun writing the first curriculum for the ethics chair. I want it to be perfect. This is the first step toward earning your forgiveness. I am free now, and I finally know the cost of honor. Thank you for saving me. He was fulfilling the terms of his forgiveness contract, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. He was beginning to find the man Harold had intended him to be. The Ethics Endowment was more than a chair at a university. It was the final, non-disputable testament to my power, Harold's principles, and Bryce's path to redemption. The matriarch had ensured that the terms of justice would be eternal, creating a legacy that no amount of greed could ever destroy. The Ethics Endowment was funded, the governance was restructured, and the corporate betrayal was a matter of public record, settled. I had secured Harold's legacy, disciplined my son, and exacted an ethical price for the contempt I was shown. The matriarch's work was complete. But after the dust settled, a profound emptiness remained. I had won the war, yet I was still alone in the quiet, familiar confines of my small house, the very simplicity that Camilla had mocked. The victory had restored my dignity, but it hadn't replenished my soul. The time had come for me to step entirely out of the shadow of the past, out of the life defined by Harold's memory and Bryce's betrayal, and into a future entirely my own. I realized that the ultimate act of reclaiming my dignity was not the legal triumph in the boardroom, but the physical departure from the place where I had been wounded. I had proven my worth. Now I needed to choose my happiness. A familiar voice cut through the quiet solitude of my thoughts. Sebastian Whitmore. He called me later that week, not to discuss compliance or dividends, but simply to check on me. Evelyn, he said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of unwavering support, the firm is stabilized. Bryce is complying with every term. Nora reports genuine commitment. But now, what about your life? The Legacy Veto gave you freedom from obligation. What will you do with that freedom? His question resonated deeply. I had secured a future for Harold's firm, but I hadn't secured one for Evelyn. I don't know, Sebastian. I'm too used to fighting. I don't know how to simply live again. He chuckled, a warm, reassuring sound. Then allow me to offer a suggestion. Remember when we first spoke and I mentioned my property in Tuscany? It's a small villa overlooking the Val d'Orcia, surrounded by olive groves and rolling hills. The kind of place where complexity fades and simplicity is, genuinely, a virtue. Tuscany, I whispered, the word tasting like sunlight and foreign promise. It was the antithesis of the cold, ambitious Chicago boardroom. It was a place where my English teacher's soul and my new matriarchal strength could finally coexist. The place needs a soul, Evelyn, Sebastian continued. It needs an architect of language to appreciate its quiet beauty. I need to be there for several months to oversee the final structural renovations. I am extending an invitation, not as a client, but as a friend who understands the high cost of principle. Come to Tuscany. Find the joy you earned. The offer was staggering. It wasn't an escape. It was a deliberate choice of self-determination. A physical journey from the site of my betrayal to a landscape of complete renewal. It was the ultimate, defiant move away from the taint of poverty and into the front row of my own life. I accepted the following weeks were a whirlwind of quiet, decisive action. I sold the small house, the physical location of my grief and my victory. I took only the essentials, my books, my teaching notes, and Harold's locket. The money from the sale, combined with a substantial dividend payout from the stabilized firm, meant that I, the former English teacher, was now independently wealthy and absolutely free. I had always defined myself by my responsibilities to Harold, to Bryce, to my students. Now I defined myself by my choice. I was choosing peace, beauty, and the unknown promise of a new life. My final meeting before leaving was with Bryce. He came to my empty house, looking healthier, more grounded. Having spent weeks dedicated to the charitable foundation and the Ethics Endowment curriculum, the chains of debt were gone, replaced by the weight of genuine responsibility. The ethics chair is officially funded and functioning, Mom, he reported, his voice filled with pride. We have the first seminar scheduled. I even wrote a module on the linguistic architecture of ethical documents based on your original work. I'm proud of you, Bryce, I told him honestly. You are honoring your father's memory not by managing the money, but by protecting the principles. He looked around the empty room. I know you're leaving, Mom. I understand why. You deserve this freedom. But I want you to know the price you demanded, the $18 million counteroffer, it didn't ruin me. It saved me. It forced me to value integrity over image. I will fulfill the contract of your forgiveness, Mom. I promise. I handed him a Latira final personal note. This is not legal, Bryce. This is for the man Harold and I raised. It simply says that my forgiveness is complete when your work, your commitment, and your new life make you truly happy. Until then, you are earning it, day by day. He embraced me tightly, a long, genuine hug that felt like a final emotional release. The chapter of betrayal was closed. My journey to Italy was not just a flight. It was a re-entry into life. Sebastian met me at the Florence airport. The familiar, quiet strength of his presence was a comforting constant in the foreign landscape. He didn't ask about the firm. He asked about my favorite poet. The Tuscan villa was a breathtaking vision of stone and cypress, overlooking fields that rolled like waves toward the horizon. It was a landscape of profound simplicity, the kind that forces introspection and quiet joy. Welcome home, Evelyn, Sebastian said, leading me to a sun-drenched terrace. This is your front row. This is where you write your own script. My new life began immediately. I started working with Sebastian, not as a legal analyst, but as a curator of culture. We planned to transform an unused wing of the villa into a small library and writing retreat for students and artists, mirroring the charitable focus of the endowment. My intellectual energy, once focused on finding deception in legal texts, was now focused on cultivating beauty and truth. I spent my mornings walking the olive groves, my afternoons reading without the shadow of a corporate deadline, and my evenings sharing wine and conversation with Sebastian. He was a man who understood the language of power, but chose to speak the language of quiet respect. He saw the matriarch, but loved the English teacher. The true transformation came not in the scenery, but in the internal silence. In Chicago, I was constantly analyzing, defending, and bracing for the next attack. In Tuscany, I learned to trust the quiet. The betrayal and the bitterness began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of self-worth that no amount of money or social status could ever have. It's purchased. I wrote in my journal, no longer about grief or legal strategy, but about the structure of a peaceful life. I once thought happiness was the absence of sorrow. Now I know it is the presence of choice. I chose to walk away from the financial world I saved. I chose a quiet life over a loud victory. And in doing so, I chose myself, absolutely and without compromise. The ultimate irony was that my current life, my quiet villa, my European journeys, my independence was the very thing Camilla had tried to deny me. I was now living a life of authentic, ethical affluence. The true thorn stature that she and Bryce had ruined themselves chasing, I had used the immense power granted by my late husband to buy myself. It's the one thing money truly cannot buy. Peace. Years passed. Bryce continued to excel in his advisory role, eventually becoming the firm's first chief ethics officer, a non-operational but immensely powerful position dedicated to upholding the values of the Ethics Endowment. He never wavered in his commitment. The price of his redemption paid in full. Camilla, unable to maintain the life without the corporate facade, eventually divorced Bryce and faded back into her own elite circle. Her final act of compliance completed in silence. Sebastian and I built a life of shared intellectual curiosity and quiet affection. Our partnership was defined by respect and a mutual appreciation for the beauty of a life lived honestly. I was the matriarch who had saved the firm, and he was the man who taught me how to finally enjoy the spoils of that moral victory. My life, once relegated to the back row, was now lived permanently in the front row of my own creation. I was not defined by my widowhood, my poverty, or my son's betrayal. I was defined by my unassailable dignity, my linguistic brilliance, and my courageous choice to seek justice, then peace. The Legacy Veto was Harold's final gift to me, but front row forever was the gift I finally gave to myself.